Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the MedEqual podcast, where we talk about the representation of minorities in clinical trials. I'm your host, Kathy Phelan. The school year has already begun for me. What about you, Rian?
I hope you got the classes you wanted. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. My school has also started, but homework's already beginning to pick up. So, who are we meeting today?
Today, we have not one, but two guests from Kitsa AI. We are meeting Mr. Nyamathi, co-founder and CEO of Kitsa AI, and Dr. Behera, their Chief Medical Officer.
Excited to host them. We recently signed a partnership with them as well because they're also trying to improve representation in clinical trials. They're focusing on pharmaceutical companies and medical research, while MedEqual's focused on the community.
Absolutely, we are natural allies. Without further delay, let's bring them in.
Here's the Kitsa AI board.
Mr. Nyamathi and Dr. Behera, tell us about yourself.
Hey guys. So first of all, please feel free to call us by our first names. Uh, it's like the joke says, Mr. Nyamthi is my dad, so you can call me Ajay. Good to be on this podcast. It is a pleasure and an honor, and knowing what MedEqual does and knowing the team behind it, it is fantastic what you guys are doing. Um, as a background, my name is Ajay. I have about 20 odd years experience in the technology space. I'm an engineer by training, I have management graduate degrees in technology management. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kitsa. We'll talk a little more about what Kitsa does and how we are helping the cause that you guys are really working on. But over to you, Deepak.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deepak Behera. I was trained as a physician in India and came to the US, went into academic research, then started leading clinical development and medical affairs in pharma, as well as I'm very deeply interested in expanding clinical trials in underrepresented communities as well. And so I do actively work in that area. I grew up in South Asia, of course, where trials were essentially non-existent outside of big hospitals. And alongside with Kitsa, wanted to create that bridge, one that expands these trial access to community medicines and community practices and ensures patients of all backgrounds are included.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was kind of wondering, like, what is the inspiration behind Kitsa AI? Like, in general, who are your clients?
Yeah. First of all, I would make a clarification. I would not call it Kids AI because I'm a strong believer that AI is there in every place. So just call us Kitsa. That is good enough. But I'll tell you the inspiration to what eventually led to creation of this company. About I've been in the healthcare and life sciences space for more than a decade now. But about 8 years ago, I saw firsthand how broken the clinical trial ecosystem was. A very senior colleague of mine was caring for his wife who had a rare form of breast cancer, and I watched him struggle endlessly to find the right clinical trial for her. He was a CXO, he had good financial resources, he was extremely knowledgeable about her condition, about what opportunities were there. Somebody of his means was struggling so much to find a clinical trial. It was just flabbergasted. I was just flabbergasted. This was at a time when Amazon can predict precisely what cereal would you like to have the next morning. It was shocking to me that something as critical as access to life-saving clinical trials was so opaque and inefficient. That really piqued my interest, and that really made me looking in this direction of inefficiencies in access to clinical trials. Um, I eventually made this the focus of my graduate research at Columbia University. I wrote a thesis on the increasing access to clinical trials, how can you reach more patients, etc. I took a bunch of this work when I joined Amazon. I used to lead the clinical trial solutions business in Amazon, and I wrote a paper in Amazon and created a team to accelerate clinical trial recruitment among patients. The deeper I went, it became very clear that the barriers were not scientific. I think it was barriers were more communication gaps, misaligned incentives in this among the stakeholders. And then I decided that if I have to solve this problem, I need to really get knee deep into this. And so I quit Amazon along with some of my colleagues, and we started Kitsa. So at Kitsa, we started with the first principle. The goal is very simple. How do you create a platform where the key players in clinical research, which you would imagine are hospitals and pharma companies, can collaborate very effectively? Period. That's the important thing that we are trying to do. By leveling the playing field for healthcare providers of all sizes, we make it possible for patients to access clinical trials uh, in a more uniform manner. You don't have to be next to a Stanford to get access to a life-saving drug. You could be in rural Missouri for all you care, and you could still get access. So that is the whole intent behind Kitsa. And our sites, our stakeholders are on one side hospitals, research centers, and community practices, which are conducting clinical trials, which can take clinical trials to their patients, and as well as pharma companies which conduct these studies. In simple words, we are bringing both sides of the ecosystem together so that together they can reach patients faster and more effectively.
No, that's amazing. I guess I'm also wondering that from the large pharma companies' perspective, what are those barriers to clinical trials when they clearly know that it is an issue that there isn't representation in those trials?
Yeah, so um, having worked with some of the pharma companies, the barrier isn't necessarily acceptance of the need for diversity or diverse populations. The barrier really is operational. They don't have direct access of traditionally pharma companies and CROs through the CROs and all. They reach out to their sites, the site databases that they already have in mind. They have been traditionally going back to, they know of those sites, they keep going back to them. Again, traditionally, most of those sites have been in well-educated, well-understood, affluent places, which have, again, for the most parts, underrepresentation of diversity, right? And now, if you look at them to start new sites, train them in clinical trials, and have them participate in clinical trials is a very heavy lift, which is not pharma's mode of conduct. The trials have to learn and educate themselves and prepare themselves to participate in clinical trials before pharma can approach them. And even if they do that, many of those sites and clinics don't necessarily know how to approach back to the pharma, right? So how to reach back out to pharma saying that, hey, we are a site and we are ready. So there has to be something that, number one, reduces the burden of, first of all, educates the sites on our clinics and hospitals on the need and the usefulness of participating in clinical trials. Number two, operationalize them, give them the administrative infrastructure, the compliance infrastructure, regulatory infrastructure that is necessary for them to be a part of clinical trials. Number three, give them that marketplace or the connection or the environment, the platform where they can now get clinical trials into their clinical sites as well.
Similarly, though, it seems like more of a complicated process, really. What is the incentive for all of this? If not for political pressure, why would we try to strive to be more inclusive, particularly in the current political climate?
So,
Deepak, go ahead. Yeah.
yes, in the way that I see it is not, well, the political environment simply makes things easy or not. But the incentive from pharma companies is to have accurate data. It is both clinical and scientific. The clinical and scientific teams at pharma companies are very keenly aware of it. So is the FDA. They're very aware of the impact and problems that we all face, and the differences in populations and the need to include all of that. Uh, the there is incentive. It's just the operational barrier that they can't get over. Right. So it is very difficult. There is a business case as well for that matter. The incentive is a business case where now the results apply to a larger population. And the larger population, there is trust in those results from, people of every, origin, right? So, Ajay, I don't know if you wanted to add something to
Yeah,
this.
absolutely. So when the administration changed, people were asking me, "Hey, does this change? Does it, because there was a defocusing on DEI and other initiatives, people ask, will it make a difference for you guys?" The thing is, I keep emphasizing that diversity in clinical trials is not a cultural issue, it's not a social issue, it's not a political issue. It's a scientific issue. You need to have diverse patients because each of us, from the environment we have grown, the genotype, the genetics of it, the phenotype, our physical aspects of it, right, have react differently for different medicines. If you want to create medicines that are that have to be applicable for larger population of the world, you need to make sure while you're testing it, you're actually testing at the on diverse patients, a microcosm of what eventually will be your market. So I think it's a scientific need, really. I don't think this is anything to do with politics of politics of cultural diversity or anything.
I guess I'm also wondering then, how are companies like Kitsa changing the situation on the ground? Like when you approach pharmaceutical companies, do they readily embrace this need for representation, or is there a need to like convince them or persuade them somehow? Especially like what as you're like kind of trying to assign new sites that would bring that accurate representation.
I think Deepak hinted in his point. I think the fact that diversity is required is an established fact. I don't think anybody needs convincing. But then, why doesn't somebody really not? Why are we failing on the diversity angle? Is the challenge of doing it. There is a bit of inertia. When you create a trial, and you just can't expect diverse patient to suddenly show up at your door. You have to be very deliberate and intentional about how you design and conduct your studies. Sometimes there are biases, unknown biases that are built into the way you design a protocol. I'll give you an example. There's an ANC count which is required for certain trials, neutrophil count, and that is 2% less among the African American population generally. With unintentionally, if you put a level saying that everybody's ANC level should be above 1,000, unintentionally you left out a percentage of population, and that is not even clinically significant for the trial. So we want to bring in the awareness of need for diversity at the design level. First of all, you need to make sure that you're not building in unknown biases in the system itself, so that you're filtering out a big population who are right for the trials. The second thing is you need to choose the communities in which you're running the trials. We are all aware in the US, zip code pretty much determines the kind of people, the kind of opportunities you get. So you need to be aware of which is the right population that you need to go after. And then when you decide to go to a particular location, you also need to decide who are the physicians or who are the principal investigators who are going to help you in clinical trials, because clinical trials have to be done in a neighborhood. You cannot have a site 100 miles away and expect patients to turn out there, right? So all these things, to be doing these things is a complex problem. It is a very data problem. It is a very AI problem. That's where engineers like me come into play. What Kitsa is doing is simplifying the access to data, the access to that intelligence through the Gen AI models that we have developed, lower the barrier, make it very easy for the pharma to apply into their understanding to find the right locations in which you want to run a trial, find the right the doctors who can conduct the trial for them. And so that part is the problem that Kitsa is solving. There is still a ground level problem that folks are trying to solve, which is convincing the patients, removing the cultural biases, and get them through the door. But that's not a problem Kitsa is solving. What we are solving is identifying where to conduct the clinical trials, who will be helping you to conduct the clinical trials, and how do you design inclusive clinical trials. We are using technology, we're using AI, we're using expertise from folks like Deepak to bring into it and solve this problem at scale. You don't want to solve it for one pharma, you want to solve it for the 30,000 clinical trials that are running in the country today.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that's what makes like a partnership like this so powerful, where we are trying to spread our influence in the community and convince those people who may be um, less like accepting of these clinical trials, and then you guys on the larger scale with the big pharma companies. But really, who are the like decision makers or actors? I want to know, do these large pharma companies directly contract with medical centers and like somehow influence the ethnic mix of their trials?
The main decision makers are the sponsors, the pharma and biotech companies, right? They design the study, they select the CRO, they decide which sites to activate, and the CROs then operationalize the studies. And but here's the reality, though. However, sponsors and CROs, they typically go back to the default site. That's always the reality. There's the default site databases, and the problem is, again, most of those traditional sites draw from non-diverse patient populations. Now, identifying, contracting, activating new sites with access to underrepresented populations, it can be very complex. It could be time consuming, and it's not really in the wheelhouse of pharma companies' operations, right? So it's not their expertise. Beyond that, there is also another barrier. Many of these hospitals and clinics that exist in underrepresented populations do not have the operational infrastructure themselves to function as a trial site. And so that's yet another barrier. Of course, your challenge, you're taking care of one of them to educate and inform populations about clinical trials and the benefits of clinical trials. So that is one cultural barrier that you're taking care of. So there are all these various pieces, and Kitsa is taking care of yet another barrier to make it smooth and easy for clinics and patients to participate in clinical trials. So it will take a village to get everything put together, and there are many different entities trying to address many different aspects of getting clinical trials started in these kind of communities.
Definitely. And let's take a step back because we're talking so much about underrepresentation, but I don't think we've ever highlighted like what are some of the adverse impacts of underrepresentation?
Uh, the the adverse impacts or the consequences are, if I may, put them into kind of three major buckets. One is the scientific bucket, and certain groups aren't studied. We just don't know how drugs might work for them, devices or other processes and programs, how may that work, how may they might work for them. As Ajay mentioned, metabolism, genetics, diet, comorbidities, everything vary in these populations. And so if we don't have an inclusive data, we risk incomplete, misleading conclusions. And I have a very uh, kind of personal experience. There was one particular product that went into market. The clinical trials performed as per guidelines and was performed with MRI as one of the screening tools or something, or one of the tools that was utilized in the trial. Now, if you think about it, the MRI was done as standard of care, and the results from the MRI were included in the trial, right? Now, if you think about it, MRI has got a much higher copay compared to ultrasound for the same condition. Ultrasound can also be utilized to investigate the same condition. And the communities that did not have the let's say financial power to go for an MRI, the physician typically proceeds with an ultrasound, and the result of it an ultrasound. Now, the results of this trial, which had MRI as one of this as one of the main investigations, do not apply necessarily to the population that got ultrasound as one of their investigations. The results of ultrasound are different. The results of MRI are different. The population selection is different. And now, since they don't exactly translate, the clinician who treats their patients using an ultrasound results is less likely to accept the results of the trial as applicable to his or her population. And that's a problem for not only the technology not being utilized properly, and they'll simply have to test it out themselves, trial and error, learn about this new technology within their populations, and which is not the ideal way to go. And also the pharma company or the sponsoring company does not get to access these populations as well. Right. Now, clinically, patients suffer, the second bucket, if you will. Patients suffer, dosing may not be optimized. There might be side effects which may be under-recognized. There could be treatment outcomes which may differ. For example, again, in South Asians, they have higher rates of metabolic syndrome, early heart disease, yet data on how therapies perform in these populations is very sparse. And it's a very well accepted, well known fact, but still a lot needs to be done to sort of bridge that gap, right? And socially, of course, underrepresentation kind of reinforces mistrust in clinical trials. So I think that is another barrier that if there is underrepresentation, there is a little bit of mistrust. So it kind of reinforces that barrier there. Communities might see medicines being developed for others and not for themselves. And it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, if you will.
No, definitely. And even
I
if we
mean,
directly,
one of
sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
even if we talk directly about like the medicines themselves, the medicines when they're being tested don't have that representation. Can that also directly lead to adverse medical outcomes when it's being pushed out to consumers, to people who need those medicines? So, for example, if I have a drug that was tested exclusively on one population and we tried to use it on someone of another population, can that also have adverse medical outcomes?
Yeah, so
Yes.
let me give you an example.
Go ahead, Ajay.
Sorry, let me just give an example, right? There is this a drug which is cholesterol lowering drug, and if I misrepresent certain facts, Deepak, please excuse me. This is a drug called Crestor, which was tested mostly on white population. When they actually tested in an Asian population, they realized that Asian population about double the blood levels compared to Caucasians, because of which there was a side effect of muscle toxicity. So for this Crestor medication, they had to eventually reduce the dose in Asian population to make it effective. Otherwise, there were increased side effects. There are enough examples like that. Plavix, which is a antiplatelet drug, which reduces blood clot. It was found ineffective or reduced effectiveness for East Asians by 60%. And that's a huge population to think of it, right? Because they have some variation with their liver enzyme CYP2C19, I think. And they had high risk of clotting events. So there are these very popular brands which, after they commercially launched, they realized either they were not effective in a certain population, or Deepak was mentioning, the dosage had to be different for them to make it, to lessen the side effects. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the adverse impact is in terms of side effect. It's also in terms of whether the results are applicable to the population. So meaning it may not be effective enough. So side effects are not effective enough, right? Both are adverse events if you think about it. Again, another example here is, we all follow guidelines on, like say, glucose levels or blood pressure levels based on Western medicine or Western population. Uh, we growing up in India, we followed those guidelines as well. We realized that they don't really truly apply. And the definition of diabetes and the cutoff value could be very different for South Asians compared to what it is for Caucasians. So I think there are all these little nuances that come into play. So where do you start medicating? All right. So where do you start treating? Could be at a different level for these populations. And so the adverse event of this entire situation, if you will, this adverse effect of this entire situation is the population that remains not identified because of spurious thresholds, now does not get the benefit of treatment that they should ideally. Yeah, just
Yeah,
adding
this is
another aspect.
this is the point that I was mentioning about design. So one of the things is we want to catch these nuances during design itself, make awareness, when, if you're aware of clinical, of course you are, there are inclusion and exclusion criteria. Some of them are very specific for the drug, some of them are unintentional. So having that knowledge of the variation for like the example that Deepak gave, figuring out if should I change the glucose blood levels in the design so that I can include more South Asians into my clinical trial is also very important. So you have to think about that right at the beginning of designing a trial.
I would agree with that. I think that um it would honestly be really scary to think that if I was suffering from some condition, say diabetes, and I was administered a medicine that, you know, it wouldn't even work for me, or maybe even has some negative side effects, like if that could be caught in the design process, that would be immensely beneficial. So, as we mentioned, we at MedEqual are committed to enhancing specifically South Asian representation in clinical trials. And as I said, we're focused on the community engagement aspect. So we have our in-person events, we write our blogs, and we do podcasts like this one, and, and we influence physicians to have their patients sign up for trials. So you guys are industry experts who belong to the community themselves. What do you guys hear about barriers specifically affecting South Asians?
Yeah. Let me take a stab at it, and I'll Deepak and more points. I think when it comes to South Asians, one of the biggest concerns is the awareness. And I must admit, while I've been talking about uh, the disparity across various ethnicities, I myself did not pay a lot of attention on how less South Asians are represented. I know, considering the fact that the co-founders are all South Asians, and just the awareness that came from talking to Rian and the medical team uh, was an eye-opening exercise for me, who's been involved so actively. So, in the same spirit, I'm saying the biggest concern is awareness. People do not simply know that clinical trials are an option, or they think it's a last resort. They don't think that is something that can be used along with standard of care. The second concern is the trust and the cultural perception, right? Growing up in India, we never saw clinical trials. And now when you hear it, when you come here, you think is a stigma or hesitation. And if you go ask one of your friends or your community members who's also a doctor, they're not necessarily supportive. So the community as such also need to be educated, not just awareness of an individual, but the cultural perception of the community also is pulls it down. In few cases, but not predominantly, there is also language and access issues. Um, just like today, in certain parts of the country, you can take your driving exams in Punjabi or Hindi, right? But most of the clinical trials, the publicity material, the informed consent data, the training material are all in English. And those nuances, even though people are educated in English, certain nuances they wouldn't understand unless the information is in their native language. I think that awareness is also important. And to an extent, this is not just a South Asian problem. This is a problem for Hispanic communities, so which a lot of pharma companies have worked towards it. But again, South Asians have multiple languages, so you also need to reach out to them, as many of them in their native language. Um, and lastly, I want to mention that there is enough evidence in the scientific community that when trials are brought to trusted physicians and community groups, then participation improves. Because ultimately, people trust their physician, people trust their community group. So you need to bring the trials to a trusted physician or trusted community groups, like temples, churches, etc. And then the participation can also increase. I don't know, Deepak, do you want to add something to this?
No, I think you covered it very well. There's not a whole lot other than I can just probably tell you my own personal experience. I grew up and trained as a physician in India, and I did not see clinical trials as a viable, activity to get engaged in as a physician. So the clinical trials or clinical research were done on only a few academic centers, And most doctors and most patients never saw research as a part of everyday care. And that is kind of translated for most people when they come here. It's just not medicine for many people, meaning it's not a part of medicine. They are aware it's somebody else that does it. Um, as physicians, we don't do it, right? We don't participate in clinical. Someone else does it. Someone in their ivory towers does clinical trials. But that mental barrier, if we crash that, we destroy that, and probably you can do it. You can probably make a sizable dent in that. They'd be more accepting, I'm sure, of clinical trials. And most South Asian physicians are in independent or small group practices. They don't have the support system, the regulatory contracts, monitoring, everything that is required to run clinical trials. And not only that, they don't see it as an option for themselves.
Well, that's really interesting because I actually also just saw a data point that like about 10% of US physicians are of South Asian origin, but a lot fewer participate in trials. So is it just that fewer doctors of South Asian heritage participate in trials, or that the community doesn't even trust these trials? Is that a more general issue? And like what needs to change for both doctors and the community to be like more aware of and care about representation?
So it's almost the same thing. If I were to say, what we just mentioned, I think is the one of the key issues. Um, I'm trying to think of an anecdotal, or some kind of an example which would explain it. But the point here is, um, I just don't think about clinical trials if I am a South Asian doctor. I have grown up in a certain community, in a culture, and I come back, come to the US with the already, my North Star as being a clinician, taking care of patients, and going back home. Clinical trials were never an option. So that education and essentially letting them know that, hey, you know what, clinical trials are a good option. Clinical trials, in fact, are a treatment option for your patient. Those that may not have any other pathway remaining. Sometimes clinical trials are life-saving. So clinical trials can be a part of your clinical care. And that assimilation needs to come to them at some point of time. They need to be able to assimilate this concept. And the second part of this is, again, not having grown up in a kind of a situation of clinical trials, or being exposed to clinical trials and how they are conducted. You aren't aware of all the requirements. Again, clinical trials are conducted and they should be conducted in a very highly regulated manner, right? And that highly regulated manner, by the way, medicine is practiced in a highly regulated manner as well. But they're familiar with that part. They're not very familiar with the highly regulatory manner that clinical trials are performed. So I think giving them that infrastructure and education on how trials are performed, and how maybe even exposure in an early stage could be helpful. There could be many approaches to get there, but I think part of the problem is, um, many South Asian physicians, again, like I said, they're independent in small practices, or smaller hospitals, and they traditionally don't do clinical trials. It's a heavy lift for their practice or their hospital or the clinic to learn trials, put the standard operating procedures in place. Put how do you start a clinical trial at my place is the question that we need to answer for them.
So how does then maybe so like I've heard as I've grown up in a South Asian household, and like my mom especially like also always likes to go for more natural, more allopathic treatments and like home remedies rather than like going to a doctor, getting actual like medicine per se. So how does maybe that play a role into this? And how do we maybe help people, especially in the South Asian community, have more of an awareness and understanding that even medicines made of chemicals in labs, those are safe and those are helpful?
It's a good question. So I think we definitely grew up in having home remedies and everything. They have a very important place back in India and South Asia. But in the US, I don't see them as competing as much with modern medicine. It is more as the first line of defense for minor issues and those kind of things at home itself. And as soon as it becomes, the pain becomes beyond, reaches a certain stage, everybody defaults back to the medicine, the clinical medicine, and they go back to the doctor, right? The proper medicine and the physicians. So the key is not to dismiss these practices, respect them, frame them as complementary. Trials are about making sure that all the modern treatments and uh, uh, you know um, uh, what we said, the chemicals and all are safe and effective for people like us. They are, yes, made of chemicals, peptides, and antibodies, but there is a very strong regulatory and compliance infrastructure in place that has evolved over the past several decades and almost a century or so to ensure that any side effects of anything is minimized. And FDA holds safety as the highest standard. Efficacy comes second in approval of medications. Of course, there's a balance to be made, but
Thank you.
that's the norm.
So we at MedEqual, we are nothing more than a student-driven non-for-profit with limited funds. How are we supposed to scale up our campaign and our initiative? Do you guys have any advice for us?
Sure. I mean, first off, kudos to what you guys are doing. I think as high school students, your sensitivity to a problem as large and complex as this, your entrepreneurial approach to solving the problem, I think has to be highly applauded. Um, for in my mind, for many issues in life, it is not the lack of money, but it's the lack of imagination that holds initiatives back. I would say you're already focusing on the right thing, which is community engagement. That's usually the hardest part of the ecosystem. And then you guys have really done a good job in building trust. And there's a lot of information about what you guys have done on your website. Good work there. But if I have to give you some advice to how do you maximize, I would like to rephrase your question. How do we maximize the impact of what you guys are doing with whatever resources you have? I would suggest three things. One is leverage partnerships. You don't have to reinvent everything because there are enough people trying to solve the problem. Like people like me, people like Deepak, we have been independently trying to solve this problem over the years. I think if you just connect to the right people and write on to the activities that they are doing, that would have that's something that you could just do with your time and a little bit of connecting the dots, and you can amplify your reach. The second thing I can think of is do digital plus local. I think you guys are on the right path. I know there are events that you conduct in temples or in religious places, etc. Pair that up with digital campaigns, WhatsApp groups, short explainer video. You're a generation who understands TikTok very well. You're a generation, which understands how to use the video media very well. Create some explainer videos. Talk about stuff. Talks about blogs and community. Try to go into the community languages too. Rian, if you don't speak Hindi natively, you can always take help of people who speak that language, and they're happy to help create those little videos. For a change, your parents can become cool by starring in your TikTok video. The third thing is tell more stories. Nothing succeeds, nothing hits people in the gut than a story of somebody they identify with. If you actually have a success story of some South Asian origin, Indian origin person having participated in a clinical trial, benefited, share their experience, and then send a story, I think that in my mind creates the highest impact. And all of the things I've told you are things don't need a lot of money. Um, as I told earlier, also we are from Kitsa, we are very happy to support some of your initiatives. Uh, you know, Deepak, I should now call the Dr. Deepak Behra because the audience will know who is there speaking to. So Dr. Behra is part of many physician groups. He's a very influential person in the community. and the South Asian community. And I've actually met so many South Asian Indian doctors through Deepak. So if we will also support you to get access to such groups. I know one of your initiative is I Pledge. Is that correct? I Pledge. Um, so we are happy to support you in the community activities, the I Pledge activities by giving you access to groups that we know.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. And on behalf of MedEqual, we're so grateful to have spoken with you today. I think we've all learned lessons on how to improve representation, what we can do on the grassroots level and with pharmaceutical companies. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Pleasure is all mine.
Yes, and thank you for having us. It's a great initiative. I echo Ajay's sentiments, and anything we can do to help, feel free to reach out.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Well, that was great, Riaz. I really enjoyed speaking to Mr. Nayamathi and Dr. Behera. They have really fresh perspectives. Something I mentioned that we haven't heard much before is the language barrier that stems from all the different languages that are spoken in the South Asian community. It's one thing that all clinical trials and like advertising are usually typed out in English. And, for the Hispanic community, we could solve it easily by giving them specifically Spanish documents. But specifically for South Asians, there are so many languages that the language barrier is real and it is something that has to be focused on and we have to tackle it.
No, definitely. I think it's so important to recognize that this isn't a political issue. It's not a cultural issue either. It's a scientific issue that is literally causing people to not have access to the medicines they need. It's so important to approach it from that light and make sure that we are improving that representation so that people can live healthily.
Yeah, I'm glad that they brought up that point. Okay. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of MedEqual's podcast. For our upcoming informative events around the community, you can stay updated by following our Facebook and Instagram, and help us out by sharing this podcast with your friends, family, and doctors. Thank you so much for listening. Until then, stay curious and stay locked in.